In the cold grey skies over Nazi Germany during the brutal winter of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces was bleeding to death in a war of attrition it could not afford to lose, and the architects of American strategic bombing doctrine were confronting the possibility that their entire theory of warfare might collapse before it could prove decisive. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Fleets of heavily armed B-17, flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly deep into the Third Reich in broad daylight, their massed defensive firepower theoretically sufficient to fight off German interceptors while they systematically destroyed the industrial capacity that fed Hitler's war machine. The bombers flew in tight combat box formations, each aircraft positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, creating what planners called a flying porcupine that German fighters would be unable to penetrate without suffering catastrophic losses. But theory and reality diverged savagely over the cities and factories of Germany, because the Luftwaffe had proven far more deadly, far more skilled, and far more willing to accept losses than American planners had anticipated. German pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s had developed tactics specifically designed to crack open those bomber formations, attacking from head-on where the bombers had the least defensive firepower, concentrating their cannon fire on the cockpit and engines, and pressing their attacks with a combination of technical skill and fanatical courage that was shredding American bomber groups with horrifying regularity on missions deep into Germany to targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg and Berlin. Bomber groups were sometimes losing 10, 15, even 20% of their aircraft on a single raid. And when you multiplied each lost bomber by its crew of 10 highly trained men, the casualties became unsustainable. Young men from towns across America were climbing into those bombers knowing that statistically, they had less than a 50% chance of surviving their required 25 mission tour, and the 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging crews faster than the training pipeline could replace them. The fundamental problem was range, a simple tyranny of physics and fuel capacity that threatened to make strategic daylight bombing impossible. The early American escort fighters, the twin-engine P-38 Lightning and the powerful P-47 Thunderbolt, were excellent aircraft in their own right, but they lacked the fuel capacity to escort the bombers all the way to distant targets and back. The P-38, despite its distinctive twin-boom design and impressive performance, suffered mechanical problems in the extreme cold of high altitude over Europe and could only escort bombers partway to the target. The P-47 was a magnificent fighter, brutally effective in a dogfight with its 8.50 caliber machine guns and ability to absorb tremendous battle damage. But it was also heavy and thirsty, and even with drop tanks, it couldn't stay with the bombers beyond the German border. This created a lethal gap in coverage where the bombers had to proceed unescorted into the heart of German airspace, and the Luftwaffe exploited this gap with murderous efficiency. German fighter controllers tracked the American formations on radar, waited for the escorts to turn back, and then vectored in mass formations of interceptors that fell upon the bombers like wolves on wounded prey. The bomber crews called this the killing zone, and they flew through it with white knuckles and prayers, watching other fortresses explode or spiral down trailing smoke, counting the parachutes, knowing their own aircraft might be next, and all the while the generals back in England were searching desperately for a solution that would allow them to continue the bombing campaign without losing the entire 8th Air Force in the process. The solution, when it arrived, came from an unlikely combination of British engineering brilliance and American industrial genius, married together in what would become the most successful fighter aircraft of World War II and arguably the most beautiful airplane ever built. The North American P-51 Mustang had begun its life as a disappointment, an aircraft designed and built with remarkable speed to fulfill a British order for fighters, but equipped with an American Allison engine that gave it excellent performance at low altitude but left it gasping for power above 15,000 feet where The air grew thin and the bomber. War was fought. The British, desperate for aircraft during their darkest hours, took delivery of the early Mustangs and used them effectively for ground attack and reconnaissance, but recognized that the airframe itself was exceptional, perhaps the most aerodynamically clean fighter design anyone had yet produced, and some brilliant engineer at Rolls-Royce had the inspired idea of taking that magnificent American airframe and mating it with the best high-altitude engine in the world, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that had powered Spitfires to victory in the Battle of Britain. The British sent several Mustangs back to Rolls-Royce for conversion, and the results were electrifying. The aircraft's performance at altitude improved so dramatically that it was immediately obvious this was the answer everyone had been seeking, but it took American industrial might and engineering prowess to transform this promising prototype into the war-winning weapon that would ultimately appear over Germany in overwhelming numbers. North American Aviation, working with Packard Motor Company, which was licensed to produce the Merlin engine in the United States, threw themselves into the task of perfecting the P-51B and ultimately the definitive P-51D variant with the kind of focused intensity that American industry brought to every challenge during those years when the entire nation was mobilized for victory. They didn't just bolt a British engine into an American airframe and hope for the best. They completely re-engineered the installation to optimize every aspect of performance, redesigning the air intake, the cooling system, the propeller, the fuel system, working out thousands of technical details to ensure that every component functioned flawlessly together. The result was an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any other fighter in the world. A machine that could cruise at 300 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, could reach speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour in level flight, could climb like a homesick angel, could turn inside anything the Germans could throw at it, and most importantly, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,000 miles, and still have fuel remaining to engage in combat. The P-51D, with its elegant teardrop canopy providing panoramic visibility, its 650 caliber machine guns, its internal fuel capacity augmented by drop tanks, represented the absolute pinnacle of piston engine fighter design. And when it began arriving in England in large numbers in late 1943 and early 1944, it changed the entire character of the air war over Europe in a matter of months. The bomber crews, who had been watching their fellow aircraft fall from the sky in flames over the heartland of Germany, began to notice something remarkable happening as winter turned to spring in 1944, and it gave them hope for the first time in months. The German fighters that had previously swarmed their formations with near impunity once the short-range escorts turned back were now being challenged by American fighters that appeared seemingly from nowhere, flying high above the bombers at altitudes the P-47s and P-38s could barely reach. These sleek silver angels that dropped down out of the sun onto the attacking Germans with devastating effect. The Mustang pilots had the advantage of altitude, which they could trade for speed in a dive. They had the advantage of superior visibility from their bubble canopies, which allowed them to spot threats before being spotted themselves. They had the advantage of range, which meant they could stay with the bombers throughout the entire mission instead of having to turn back early. And they had the advantage of simply being better, faster, and more maneuverable than anything the Luftwaffe could field. The Messerschmitt 109, which had been the backbone of German fighter defense and had evolved through numerous variants into a formidable high-altitude interceptor, suddenly found itself outmatched by an American fighter that could outclimb it, outrun it, and outdive it. The Focke-Wulf 190, a brutally effective radial engine fighter that had terrorized Allied pilots earlier in the war with its roll rate and firepower, discovered that the Mustang could match its strengths and exceed them. German pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking bomber formations with relative impunity now had to watch the sky constantly for the American escorts, and when they spotted those distinctive silhouettes with the underslung radiator scoop, and the bubble canopy. They had to make the agonizing choice between pressing home their attacks on the bombers and defending themselves against the Mustangs, and increasingly, they chose survival over mission success. But the true genius of American air doctrine in 1944 was not simply escorting the bombers defensively, waiting for the Germans to attack and then responding. It was the decision to unleash the Mustang groups to actively hunt down and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, issued orders that fundamentally changed the rules of engagement for the fighter escorts, and these orders would prove to be among the most consequential decisions of the air war. He told his fighter pilots that their primary mission was no longer to stay glued to the bombers at all costs, but rather to seek out and destroy German fighters, to go after them aggressively, to chase them down to the deck if necessary, to strafe their airfields, to give them no sanctuary and no rest, to engage in a campaign of fighter versus fighter combat designed to achieve absolute air superiority through the systematic annihilation of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. This was a revolution in tactical thinking because it meant accepting that some bombers might be lost while fighters were off hunting Germans elsewhere. But the strategic payoff was immense, because it shifted the air war from a defensive struggle to protect bombers into an offensive campaign to eliminate the enemy's ability to contest the skies altogether. The Mustang pilots, men like Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier and become an American icon, Don Blakesley, who led the famous 4th Fighter Group with calculated aggression, and hundreds of other skilled and aggressive young Americans, took to this new mission with enthusiasm, because it played to their strengths and to their strengths of their magnificent aircraft. The Mustang groups began roaming the skies over Germany like aerial cavalry, not just waiting for the Germans to come to them, but actively seeking combat. And when they found German fighters, they pursued them relentlessly. If a German pilot dove for the deck trying to escape, the Mustang followed him down and shot him out of the sky at treetop level. If German fighters tried to form up for an attack, the Mustangs hit them during the vulnerable assembly period before they could coordinate their assault. If the Germans tried to land to refuel and rearm, the Mustangs followed them to their airfields and strafed them on the ground, destroying aircraft that would never fly again and killing experienced pilots who could never be replaced. This was total warfare in 3 dimensions, a campaign of attrition that the Germans simply could not win, because the mathematics were brutally simple. The United States was producing fighters and training pilots faster than they could be lost, while Germany was losing both aircraft and pilots faster than they could be replaced, and the quality differential was steadily widening in America's favor. The young German pilots being thrown into combat in 1944 had far less training than their predecessors, sometimes as little as 100 hours of flight time before being sent up against American pilots who had 200 or 300 hours plus combat experience, and the result was a systematic slaughter that German commanders watched with growing horror as their fighter force was ground to pieces. The aerial battles that raged over Germany during the spring of 1944 were spectacular and deadly. Dogfights involving dozens or even hundreds of aircraft swirling across miles of sky. But the outcome was increasingly predetermined by the superior performance of the P-51 and the superior training and tactical flexibility of American pilots. A typical engagement might see a formation of Mustangs at 30,000 feet, spotting a group of Messerschmitt 109s climbing to attack a bomber stream below, and the Americans would have every advantage from that point forward. They could choose to engage or not. They could dictate the terms of combat. They could use their altitude advantage to build speed in a dive and slash through the German formation, shooting down 2 or 3 aircraft in a single pass, then using their superior speed to zoom back up to altitude before the Germans could respond effectively. If the Germans tried to run, the Mustangs could catch them because they were simply faster in level flight. If the Germans tried to fight, the Mustangs could outturn them and get on their tails for a killing shot. the only real hope for a German pilot encountering Mustangs was to somehow separate a single American from his wingman and gang up on him with numerical superiority. But the Americans flew in mutually supporting pairs and fours, and they maintained radio discipline that allowed them to coordinate their attacks and warn each other of threats, while German radio procedures were often cumbersome and their formations less flexible. The P-51 pilots racked up kill after kill, the leading aces shooting down dozens of German aircraft each. And while individual pilot skill certainly mattered, the overwhelming factor was that they were flying a superior machine backed by superior logistics and superior training. The strategic impact of this air superiority campaign became undeniably clear as winter turned to spring and spring moved toward summer in 1944, because the Luftwaffe was dying, not from a single catastrophic defeat but from 1,000 cuts, from the daily attrition of losing aircraft and pilots in numbers. That could not be sustained. German aircraft production actually increased dramatically in 1944, despite the strategic bombing campaign, with factories dispersed and moved underground, producing hundreds of fighters per month. But there was no way to quickly produce experienced pilots, and the veterans who had carried the Luftwaffe through the early war years were being killed at an accelerating rate. Every time an expert with dozens of kills went down, he was replaced by a novice with minimal training, who would likely be dead within weeks or even days of entering combat. The quality of German aviation fuel declined as refineries were bombed and supplies dwindled, forcing pilots to fly on synthetic fuels that damaged engines and reduced performance. The entire infrastructure of German air defense was coming apart under the sustained pressure of American and British air attacks, and by the early summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Still dangerous, still capable of inflicting losses, but no longer capable of contesting Allied air superiority in any meaningful way. This air superiority was not an end in itself but, rather, the essential prerequisite for the success of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy that began on June 6, 1944. The men who loaded into landing craft and stormed the beaches of France, who faced German machine guns and artillery, who fought their way inland through the hedgerows of Normandy, did so under the protective umbrella of near-total Allied air superiority. And that umbrella had been purchased by the Mustang pilots and their fellow fighter pilots who had systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe in the skies over Germany during the preceding months. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe was able to mount only a handful of sorties over the invasion beaches, so completely had it been decimated, and German soldiers, who had grown accustomed to air support in earlier campaigns, now looked up at skies filled with Allied aircraft and knew with certainty that they were going to lose this war. The Mustang had not won World War II single-handedly. Wars are far too complex for any single weapon system to be truly decisive, but it had broken the back of German air power at the critical moment when air superiority was most needed, and in doing so it had enabled everything that followed: the successful invasion of France, the destruction of German armies in the West, the advance into Germany itself, and ultimately victory in Europe. The pilots who flew the P-51 Mustang were mostly young men in their early 20s, many of them barely old enough to drink legally, but they were the products of the most extensive pilot training program ever undertaken, men who had been carefully selected for their reflexes and intelligence and aggressiveness, who had spent hundreds of hours learning to fly and fight, who had been taught tactics and gunnery and navigation, until those skills became instinctive. They were not supermen. They were simply Americans who had been given the best training and the best equipment their nation could provide, and they had used both with devastating effectiveness. They fought with a combination of professional competence and aggressive spirit that reflected the culture they came from, a culture that valued individual initiative and rewarded success, that encouraged its young men to be confident and bold, that gave them responsibility and expected them to rise to meet it. When these pilots climbed into their Mustangs and flew east across the Channel toward Germany, they were carrying with them not just their own lives and the hopes of the bomber crews they protected, but the industrial might of America, the productive genius of a nation that could design and build the finest fighter in the world and then mass produce it by the thousands, that could train pilots by the tens of thousands, that could supply everything needed to sustain a vast air armada on the far side of an ocean. The P-51 Mustang was a triumph of American engineering and American industrial capacity, a weapon that combined British innovation with American execution to create something greater than the sum of its parts, and in the hands of skilled and aggressive American pilots, it became the instrument that killed the Luftwaffe and opened the door to victory in Europe. The men who flew it and the men who built it and the men who commanded it were all part of the greatest generation, and they accomplished something that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. They took control of the skies over Nazi Germany away from an enemy that had seemed invincible, and they did it through superior technology, superior training, superior tactics, and superior determination. They were our fathers and grandfathers, these Mustang pilots and the ground crews, who kept their aircraft flying, and the factory workers who built them, and they deserve to be remembered not just with gratitude but with or for what they accomplished in our nation's finest hour.